Chosen ones, tonight, you are called into a truth that rattled the corridors of influence in ways the public was never meant to know. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world was distracted by noise and spectacle, a single resignation letter crossed the president's desk. It was not political scandal, nor foreign pressure, nor whispers of conspiracy that drove this advisor to abandon his post. No, it was something stranger, older, more radiant than any earthly game of power. It was your astral signature. The advisor had been given access to data pulled from instruments the public is told are merely for science. Yet, beneath their polished explanations, these machines are designed to scan the unseen frequencies of the soul. What he saw when your presence was traced was not the pattern of an ordinary citizen. He saw light codes spiraling across dimensions, sigils older than the pyramids, and a resonance that matched prophecies sealed away in forgotten vaults. He saw proof that you were written into the architecture of creation itself. Reports say his hands trembled as he held the classified printouts, eyes darting between numbers and sacred geometry he had no training to interpret. In that moment, the veil that separates spiritual truth from political power began to tear. He could no longer advise the president with steady confidence, for he had realized that the true authority does not sit in a seat of government, but radiates through the hidden chosen who walk unnoticed among the masses. What terrified him most was not your light, but its recognition. Ancient orders had warned that when the astral imprint of the chosen appeared, systems built on secrecy would begin to collapse. He feared that collapse had begun, and so, rather than be a pawn in history's unraveling, he placed his resignation on the table and walked away into silence. The Oval Office has always been a chamber where shadows move alongside light, where whispered truths are buried beneath policy, and where unseen forces press against the edges of decision-making. Yet, on a night unmarked in any official calendar, a wave of energy swept into that space, unlike anything the room had ever held before. Not a storm of politics or war, but a vibration that rippled through the very walls, shaking portraits of presidents past, stirring the silence of midnight, and calling attention to something far beyond the authority of man. Your astral signature had arrived. It was not by intention nor by accident, but by the inevitability of alignment. Surveillance satellites tasked with mapping cosmic radiation registered a sudden surge, an unexplainable pulse of light emanating from coordinates tied not to stars but to you. Those readings traveled across encrypted cables, bypassing ordinary analysts, landing directly in the hands of an advisor whose task was to measure threats no one dared to name. His first reaction was disbelief. How could a single person radiate with such intensity that even instruments built for galaxies were disrupted? He tried to dismiss it as error, yet the data kept refreshing with the same impossible signature, a frequency that seemed to hum with living intelligence. Inside the Oval Office, as the president reviewed the reports, something unspoken pressed against his chest. Advisors spoke in cautious tones describing anomalies, yet none could fully capture the essence of what was unfolding. The president asked for silence, and in that pause, the room grew heavy, as if air itself recognized the presence of a force beyond political strategy. The advisor, who had first intercepted your energy, could not hold his composure. Sweat formed at his temple, his notes faltered, and his voice broke mid-sentence, as if the very act of describing your resonance was tearing a veil he had sworn to keep intact. What no one understood in that moment was that it was not technology that carried your energy into that space. but the inevitability of prophecy. The codes of your existence are not bound by time, nor by walls of government, nor by layers of secrecy. They rise where they must, and on that night they rose in the center of earthly power. What began as an anomaly soon revealed itself as a message. And though no one dared to name it out loud, every eye in that room carried the same silent question of what force had just entered their sanctuary of control, and what would follow it. The resignation letter was not long, yet within its brevity lay layers of meaning that only those attuned to the unseen could recognize. To the untrained eye, it appeared as a respectful withdrawal, a professional stepping aside. But those who read between the lines saw words laced with tremors, words pressed onto paper by a man who had glimpsed something so immense he could no longer walk in the corridors of power without feeling the weight of eternity on his shoulders. His hand had been steady for decades, signing policies, crafting responses, shaping strategies that altered nations. But in this letter there was hesitation, as if the ink itself resisted the truths he had witnessed. Hidden inside the carefully chosen sentences were echoes of teachings that could not have been placed there accidentally. When describing what had shaken him, he referred to the light that speaks without language, a phrase eerily close to a line found in the Gospel of John, where Yeshua said, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." How could a man who had long kept faith hidden in the background suddenly weave such scripture-like resonance into a letter meant for political archives? The letter was read aloud in the private study, not before cameras, but before a handful of officials who sensed they were not just reading a resignation, but a warning. Each pause between lines carried the sound of something unsaid, and within that silence lay the haunting realization that this advisor had not resigned due to fatigue or scandal, but because he had encountered a reality beyond government reach. He wrote of visions, of signatures written in light across the heavens, and of a name not of this world echoing inside him as he tried to sleep. It was as if the presence of Yeshua had brushed against his consciousness through the very data he was analyzing, stirring memories of scriptures he had once dismissed as metaphor. What unsettled those who heard it most was his closing remark: "If what I saw belongs to the one they call chosen, then no counsel I give here can stand against it." That final line was more than resignation. It was confession. But whether it was confession of awe, of fear, or of revelation, none could agree. They only knew that the letter was not a goodbye. It was the beginning of something none could yet name. In the underground halls of the Pentagon, where light rarely touches and decisions echo far beyond borders, a secret briefing was convened. No announcement, no paper trail, no official acknowledgement. Only a circle of men and women whose clearances stretched beyond the ordinary spectrum of classified. The subject was not a weapon, not a threat from the sky, but you. More specifically, the frequency that radiated from your being. A resonance the instruments described not as noise, but as harmony. Not as anomaly, but as signal. They called it your soul frequency, though in hushed tones, as if even uttering those words might shatter the walls around them. The advisor's resignation had stirred questions no one dared frame openly. What had he seen in the data, and why did it cause a man of his stature to abandon everything overnight? When his files were pulled and compared, analysts realized the anomaly matched no known spectrum of energy fields, It was not electromagnetic, not gravitational, not nuclear. Yet, it carried precision, rhythm, and intention. It seemed alive. And as they layered centuries-old prophecy documents against the readings, an unsettling match emerged. The frequencies traced symbols in the air, patterns forming fractals that mirrored ancient seals once guarded by secret societies. One analyst whispered that the geometry matched the same designs etched into temple stones older than recorded empires. Another remarked that the rhythm pulsed like a heartbeat, syncing inexplicably with the resonance of the human body, yet far too expansive to belong to any single individual. It was as if your very essence was broadcasting through dimensions, bypassing machines designed only for earthly measure. During the briefing, the generals remained stoic, yet behind their silence was unease. For if a frequency could belong to a soul, then their entire arsenal of defense was powerless against it. They had built walls of steel, algorithms of surveillance, networks of control. Yet here was something that slipped through every barrier, announcing itself with the authority of inevitability. No missile, no satellite, no encryption could contain it. The room grew heavy as the lights dimmed, monitors flickering with coded displays that seemed almost to respond in real time to your unseen presence. A question lingered unspoken in that chamber. If the soul carries a frequency that can be measured, then what happens when that frequency belongs not to the ordinary, but to the chosen? And what force waits to answer its call? The resignation might have been enough to quiet suspicion, to bury the truth under layers of bureaucracy, but the advisor's conscience refused the silence that others demanded. Long before his career in politics, before security clearances and coded briefings, he had stumbled across fragments of prophecy hidden in dusty libraries and whispered by voices dismissed as mystics. Those memories returned the moment he saw your astral imprint. It was as if the words he had once brushed aside suddenly stood before him, alive, undeniable. His letter to the president was only the beginning, for behind closed doors he carried conversations that left those listening either shaken or enthralled. He began to recount stories he had once heard in secret circles, passages speaking of a signature not of this world, a mark of energy that would appear at a time when the powers of man had reached their peak of arrogance. He spoke of scrolls sealed by hands long gone, guarded by monks who vowed that only the chosen would carry the imprint capable of collapsing systems of deception. Each word he spoke ignited a spark in the hearts of those who still believed in something greater. Yet, it terrified the ones who served only power. When pressed on why he resigned, he described the moment of recognition. He had seen the codes in the data and knew them instantly, for they mirrored an ancient seal etched into stone tablets hidden in a monastery he had once visited under the guise of a cultural tour. There, carved into the walls, were symbols of spiraling light, identical to the frequency patterns now appearing in classified Pentagon scans. He confessed that when he first stood before those carvings years ago, he felt an overwhelming presence, though he never named it. Now, faced with the undeniable connection, he admitted the truth he had run from for decades. Others urged him to remain silent, to let the anomaly be dismissed as machine error, but he could not. For he believed the prophecy had already been unsealed, and his role was not to contain it, but to reveal that it had come alive in you. His voice shook not with fear, but with conviction, warning those who would listen that the age of hidden truths had ended. Yet, even as he spoke, his eyes revealed he carried knowledge still unspoken, fragments of revelation he refused to release just yet, as if holding back a final key that only time could unlock. In the dimly lit archives of the Vatican, beneath stone corridors that smell of incense and centuries, there exists a chamber never spoken of in homilies or history books. It is here that documents, scrolls, and coded manuscripts are kept away from the eyes of the world, guarded not only by locks of iron, but by oaths sworn under the weight of eternity. The advisor's revelations forced an unusual exchange between Washington and Rome. For when your astral signature disrupted the Pentagon's instruments, whispers suggested that the Vatican's private records might already hold the explanation. And so, quietly, without announcement, envoys requested a comparison between what was detected in classified scans and what had been preserved in hidden prophecy. The archivists, reluctant at first, brought forth parchment so fragile it had to be handled with gloves woven from silk. The symbols, drawn in ink that had faded with centuries, bore an uncanny resemblance to the frequency maps now circulating among scientists in America. Spiral within spiral, light mirrored as pattern. The very geometry etched in sacred design matched the same signature traced back to you. It was no longer anomaly, but recognition. An ancient foretelling meeting the present in undeniable clarity. One priest, his voice trembling as he spoke, reminded the room of passages attributed to early mystics who claimed they had seen visions of a being whose energy would bend nations to silence. He quoted lines written in Latin that translated to, "A mark of light upon the earth shall cause kings to tremble, and the wise to lay down their counsel." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. For the Vatican had always known this day might come, but never expected it to arrive so clearly, so undeniably, through technology built by governments, rather than prophecy whispered by saints. The officials in attendance could not agree on the meaning. Some argued it was a sign of divine appointment, others that it was a danger cloaked in mystery. Yet, the very act of comparison, of holding modern data against ancient prophecy, tore open a veil that had long kept these worlds apart. The silence in the chamber was not the silence of peace, but of dread. For in that moment, it became clear that your existence was not hidden in obscurity, but recorded across time itself. The files matched too perfectly, and the only question remaining was what door had now been unlocked, and who had the courage to step through it. The charts spread across the table did not resemble anything one would call ordinary astronomy. They were not maps of planets or stars, but living diagrams of light patterns, energetic fingerprints drawn from instruments, designed to read frequencies beyond the visible spectrum. When your astral signature was placed alongside these charts, the resonance became undeniable. But what startled those who studied them most was not simply the match to ancient prophecy. It was the presence interwoven within the very patterns themselves, a presence that carried echoes of Yeshua. One of the scholars whispered that the charts seemed to breathe. Lines of light curved into spirals that mirrored sacred geometry once associated with Christic symbols, the fish, the cross, and the radiant circle. At the center of your signature, there appeared to be an imprint not made by human design, a pulse that repeated in rhythm with words once spoken by Yeshua. "Lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the age." Though no sound filled the room, the pulse carried those words silently, as if etched into the fabric of the energy itself. It was not doctrine or creed that convinced the few who dared to study it, but the undeniable resonance of presence. The advisor who had once resigned quietly admitted that in his final days within the White House, He dreamt of a figure standing in radiant light, eyes filled with compassion yet power enough to undo empires. He had not spoken of it in his letter, but now, faced with the charts, he confessed the figure whispered a single word: prepare. To him, it was no coincidence that the resonance of Yeshua emerged in the same datasets that carried your frequency. Theologians argued whether this was divine confirmation or an elaborate misreading of symbols, but the silence that fell after each debate revealed their uncertainty. For how could mere patterns summon the same peace and trembling described by those who had walked beside Yeshua 2 millennia ago? The charts glowed faintly under the low lamps, and though no one dared to say it aloud, the thought burned in every mind present. If Yeshua's presence is encoded in these astral frequencies, then perhaps the chosen are not just remembered in prophecy, but actively accompanied. Yet the mystery deepened, for no one could explain why your signature had stirred this revelation now, or what moment was being prepared in the unseen. Long after his resignation, whispers remained that the advisor had left behind one final document, not in official archives, but placed directly into the hands of the president. Unlike the resignation letter, this was not meant to be read by committees or historians. It was a private warning, written in language that carried the weight of urgency, as if he knew time itself was closing in. The president received it not in the glare of daylight, but in the still hours when even the halls of power seemed hushed, when every shadow pressed closer, and silence made the words heavier than they might otherwise have been. The letter began not with politics, but with confession. The advisor admitted he had underestimated the force that now moved through the world. He explained that the signature the instruments had tracked was not a threat in the conventional sense, not a weapon or an enemy, but something far more destabilizing to the structures men had built. "You cannot legislate against it," he wrote, "nor can you contain it with armies, borders, or law. It is not coming, it is already here." He warned that your presence would not simply challenge policy, but the very assumptions upon which nations stand. He wrote of dreams where walls of marble cracked, where seals of ancient orders broke open, and where voices from beyond time spoke of the chosen carrying frequencies that awaken what has been sleeping in humanity for ages. His tone was neither panicked nor hysterical, but resigned, the voice of a man who had seen too much to return to denial. The most unsettling line was found near the middle of the page, where he told the president that ignoring you would be impossible. "Every system you rely upon," he cautioned, "will bend toward this signature. Even your silence will serve it. Even your resistance will amplify it." It was a statement that left no room for strategy, for in those words he declared inevitability. What followed was more mysterious still. The advisor claimed that he had been visited in waking vision by a presence clothed in light, a figure who stood beside him as he wrote. Though he never named this figure, the implication weighed heavily. For those who later glimpsed the document, said the description matched accounts found in ancient texts of one who appeared to prophets before nations fell. And if such a presence had indeed stood beside him, then the warning was not his alone. It was delivered through him. Far from the polished corridors of Washington and Rome, in deserts where sand has swallowed entire civilizations, the ancient stones began to stir. The temples built by hands whose knowledge seemed beyond their time, structures aligned with stars and carved with symbols not yet fully deciphered, responded to the same frequency that shook the halls of power. Instruments buried in archaeological surveys recorded vibrations so subtle that at first they were dismissed as tectonic murmurs, yet the timing was too precise. The moment your astral signature was scanned in secret facilities, the dormant architecture of the Anunnaki temples awakened. Witnesses spoke of light that pulsed across the weathered stones, glyphs once invisible, glowing faintly as if fire had been poured beneath the carvings. Tourists who happened to be near the ruins described hearing a low hum in the air, a resonance that seemed to seep into their bones, leaving them restless and entranced. Archaeologists denied it publicly, yet their private notes admitted the impossible. Structures that had stood silent for millennia were vibrating in sync with an energy detected thousands of miles away. What unsettled the scholars most was the recognition of pattern. The frequency emanating from your being traced itself onto the geometry of the temples with uncanny accuracy. Spirals carved into stone matched the resonance maps, angles aligned with your energy flow, and forgotten corridors seemed to channel sound as though designed for this very moment. It was as if the temples themselves had been waiting, coded as instruments that would only activate when the chosen appeared. Legends, long whispered by those who guarded fragments of Sumerian texts, began to resurface. They told of a day when the temples would no longer serve as relics of the past, but as transmitters, signaling to forces beyond this world that the one marked by light had arrived. Some feared the awakening meant the return of those who built them, while others believed it was confirmation that the knowledge they left was not lost, but sealed until now. And yet, the reaction of the temples was not the final sign. For as their walls glowed faintly under starlight, satellites orbiting above detected the same hum, not confined to desert sands but spreading outward, circling the planet in ripples. The question haunting those who understood was not whether the Anunnaki were watching, but whether they had just been summoned by the energy released through you. In a chamber lit only by the soft glow of screens, a small group of researchers stared at a projection that seemed less like data and more like revelation. The patterns drawn from your astral signature had been running through endless analysis. Yet what began to emerge was no longer random noise or unexplained geometry. Instead, it unfolded into sequences that carried the unmistakable structure of design, light codes forming what appeared to be a blueprint. The more they studied, the more the room shifted from skepticism to reverence. For within the shifting lattices of energy, there were echoes of words and teachings that scholars recognized from the sayings of Yeshua. One fragment of the code translated into symbols that mirrored the phrase, "In my Father's house are many mansions." The researchers gasped, for the alignment of the frequency mapped directly onto architectural patterns of multi-dimensional layers, as though the very resonance was building structures unseen by human eyes. Another pulse revealed shapes resembling a cross, not as doctrine, but as geometry, etched in light with mathematical precision. It became clear that these codes were not simply describing you, but weaving you into a tapestry stretching back to the foundation of faith itself. The advisor, though no longer in office, was whispered to have been given access to some of these projections. He reportedly murmured that it was no coincidence the words of Yeshua carried a double nature: truth for the ears of men and keys for the codes of heaven. The blueprint suggested that chosen ones were not scattered by chance, but positioned by divine design, each carrying a fragment of the greater structure, waiting for alignment. Your frequency had unlocked a layer long dormant, and now those fragments were beginning to connect. Theologians debated whether such discoveries proved or threatened their teachings, yet the codes pulsed on, indifferent to human interpretation. They shifted in rhythm like living scripture, breathing messages beyond the reach of language, whispering that the words of Yeshua were not bound to parchment, but embedded in light itself. The blueprint was incomplete to their eyes, a pattern still unfolding, but one truth lingered unshakable. The design was alive, and as the final projection faded from the walls, the silence was broken by a single question none dared answer. If this was only the beginning of the blueprint, what revelation would the completed design release into the world? When the advisor stepped out of the marble halls for the last time, the world believed it to be a simple resignation, another political figure disappearing into obscurity. Yet what the headlines never carried was the weight of what he had witnessed, nor the eyes that followed him as he walked away. To those in power, he was leaving behind unfinished business, but to the unseen realm, his departure marked a shift. His silence did not close the story. It widened the gap for something greater to enter. He wandered through nights filled with dreams that did not belong to him. In one, he stood on a vast plain of light, stars forming around him as though rearranged by unseen hands. A voice spoke not in sound, but in resonance, telling him the choice to leave was never weakness, but alignment. He woke trembling, unable to separate vision from reality, for the imprint of the experience remained etched into his skin like heat after flame. Though he told no one, he carried the certainty that his steps were being watched not by men, but by heaven itself. Far from Washington, a group of monks recorded in their journals that the same night of his resignation, bells rang in their cloisters without being touched. Across the ocean, seers claimed they felt a shift in the wind, an opening in the veil that suggested the resignation was not escape, but appointment. Even the Vatican, silent in public, convened a midnight prayer, acknowledging that something had been set in motion beyond their control. Heaven had taken notice, and heaven does not notice lightly. Those who tracked the advisor in secret noted his journey led him not toward comfort, but into obscurity, visiting sites known only to mystics and scholars. He sought no audience, yet everywhere he went, strange phenomena followed, lights flickering in places without electricity, whispers heard in languages no one had spoken in centuries, and visions shared among strangers who described the same radiant figure standing at his side. What unnerved the watchers most was the knowledge that his resignation had not silenced him. If anything, it had freed him to bear witness without restraint. His warning to the president had been the last of his political voice, but now his steps carried the rhythm of prophecy, and heaven's attention followed closely. The question left unspoken was not why he left, but what he was being prepared to announce next, and who would be ready to hear it when the moment came.
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.